Hello everyone, I hope you're having a wonderful day. Today we're going to explore a touching story about a small moment that revealed a very big kind of love. When James suddenly noticed that Tu Diep had been wearing the same worn-out shoes for a very long time, and quietly decided to do something about it without telling her. What happened next was a simple surprise that meant far more than anyone expected. If you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you won't miss our upcoming videos. The narrow dirt path that wound through the bamboo forest was quiet except for the soft rustling of leaves and the faint crunch of footsteps on dry soil. James and Tu Diep were walking side by side, slowly making their way back toward the small wooden house hidden among the tall green stalks of bamboo. They had spent the whole afternoon working in the garden behind the house, pulling weeds, watering vegetables, and repairing the small fence that protected the plants from wandering animals. Tu Diep walked a few steps ahead of him, carrying a small basket that still held a few freshly picked vegetables. She seemed relaxed, even cheerful, humming softly while she walked. James watched her quietly. It was only when they reached a rough patch of the path that he noticed something. Tu Diep stepped on a slightly uneven stone, and for a brief moment her foot tilted awkwardly to the side. She slowed down and adjusted her balance before continuing. James' eyes instinctively moved down toward her feet. That was when he saw it clearly. The shoes she was wearing were old, not just slightly worn, but truly worn down. The edges of the soles had thinned out, and one side of the stitching near the front looked like it had started to come loose. The fabric had faded, and a faint crease ran across the top where the material had bent thousands of times. James frowned slightly. He had seen her wear those shoes before, many times actually, but somehow he had never really stopped to look closely. As Tu Diep stepped over another rough patch of dirt, the sole shifted slightly again. She slowed down, but she didn't complain. Instead, she kept talking as if nothing was wrong. "And tomorrow we should probably harvest the tomatoes," she said casually. "They're almost ripe. If we wait too long, the birds might get them first." James forced a small smile. "Yeah, you're right." But his attention was still on the shoes. How long has she been wearing those? He wondered silently. The rest of the walk passed with Tu Diep chatting about the garden, the vegetables, and the plans for the next few days. James listened, occasionally answering, but his mind kept drifting back to the same thought. By the time they reached the wooden house, the sky was already turning soft with the fading light of evening. Tu Diep stepped onto the small wooden porch and placed the basket down beside the door. "Finally home," she said with a relieved sigh. She sat down on the edge of the porch and began taking off her shoes to shake out the dirt that had collected inside. James stood nearby for a moment, then slowly sat down beside her. Tu Diep held one of the shoes upside down and tapped it lightly against the wooden floor. Small bits of soil fell out. James looked at the shoe again, this time from much closer. The worn sole, the frayed thread, the slightly crooked shape. He reached out and gently took the shoe from her hands. Tu Diep looked at him, slightly surprised. "What are you doing?" she asked, smiling faintly. James turned the shoe over in his hands, examining it more carefully. "How long have you been wearing these?" he asked. Tu Diep blinked once, then laughed softly. "These?" she said. "A long time, I guess." James raised an eyebrow. "A long time meaning... how long?" Tu Diep leaned back on her hands and looked up at the bamboo swaying above them. "I don't really remember," she admitted. "Maybe a year, maybe more." James looked back down at the shoe. "The stitching is coming apart," he said quietly. Tu Diep shrugged as if it wasn't important. "It's fine," she replied casually. "I can fix that." James glanced at the sole again. "And the bottom is almost worn through." Tu Diep laughed again, this time a little sheepishly. "Well, they're comfortable," she said. James turned toward her. "You could get a new pair." Tu Diep shook her head gently. "These still work," she said simply, "and I'm used to them." She reached over and took the shoe back from his hands, brushing a bit of dirt off the side before placing it next to the other one. James watched her quietly. "You really don't mind?" he asked. Tu Diep slipped one shoe back onto her foot. "Mind what? Wearing old shoes like that?" She looked at him with a puzzled expression, as if the question itself was strange. "They're just shoes, James," she said with a small smile. "As long as they help me walk, they're doing their job." Then she stood up, stretched her arms above her head, and added playfully, "Besides, we're not exactly walking on red carpets out here." James chuckled softly, but inside, something tugged at him. Tu Diep picked up the basket of vegetables and walked inside the house. "Come on," she called over her shoulder. "Let's cook dinner before it gets too late." James followed her in, but his thoughts stayed behind on the porch, right beside those worn shoes. That night, after dinner, the small wooden house became quiet. The bamboo outside swayed gently in the wind, creating a soft, rhythmic sound against the walls. Tu Diep had gone to bed early after a long day of work. James, however, remained awake. He sat alone at the small wooden table near the window, resting his elbows on the surface while staring absent-mindedly at his phone. But he wasn't really looking at the screen. Instead, he was thinking. He remembered the first time he had seen Tu Diep working in the garden, the way she moved carefully between the rows of vegetables, the way she carried baskets that were almost too heavy for her, the way she walked down the same dirt road every morning to the small market in town, and every single time. Those same shoes. James exhaled slowly. "Why didn't I notice sooner?" he murmured to himself. He unlocked his phone and opened a search page. His fingers hesitated for a moment before typing. Comfortable walking shoes. Dozens of images appeared instantly. Different colors, different styles, different prices. James leaned closer to the screen, studying them carefully. "No, that one's too fancy," he muttered. He scrolled again. "That one wouldn't last on dirt roads." Another scroll. "That might work." He paused on a simple pair of shoes with a sturdy sole and soft fabric. They looked comfortable, durable, practical. Exactly the kind of thing Tu Diep would wear. James stared at the picture for a long moment. Then he nodded to himself. "All right," he said quietly. He set the phone down and leaned back in his chair. "Tomorrow," he whispered. Tomorrow he would go into town, and he would buy Tu Diep a new pair of shoes. Not something expensive, not something flashy, just something comfortable, something she deserved. Because somehow, the thought of her continuing to walk those long dirt roads in worn-out shoes didn't sit right with him anymore. And this time, James wasn't going to ignore it. The next morning arrived quietly, just like most mornings in the bamboo forest. Soft wind moved through the tall green stalks, and sunlight filtered gently through the leaves, casting thin shadows across the small wooden house. Birds chirped somewhere in the distance while the smell of fresh soil and morning air filled the surroundings. James woke up earlier than usual. For a moment he simply lay there, staring at the wooden ceiling, remembering the decision he had made the night before. Then he sat up. Today he was going into town. Not for vegetables, not for tools, and not for supplies for the house. This time he had a very specific mission. When he stepped outside, Tu Diep was already in the garden, crouching near the tomato plants. "Good morning," she said without turning around. James smiled. "Morning." She stood up and wiped her hands on the side of her pants before walking toward him. "I was thinking of going to the market later," she said. "We're almost out of cooking oil." James nodded casually, trying not to sound suspicious. "Actually, I might head into town first." Tu Diep looked slightly surprised. "Really?" "Yeah," James said. "I need to check something." "What kind of something?" she asked curiously. James scratched the back of his neck. "Just something." Tu Diep laughed softly. "You're being mysterious today." "Am I?" She nodded. "Well," she said, shrugging lightly, "don't get lost." "I won't," James replied with a grin. About an hour later, he was already walking along the main road that led into the small town nearby. The town wasn't big, just a handful of streets, a market, a few small shops, and the occasional cafe where locals gathered in the afternoons. James walked slowly past several stores before finally spotting what he was looking for. A small shoe shop sat quietly between a clothing store and a fruit stand. The sign above the door was simple and slightly faded, but it would do. James stepped inside. A small bell above the door jingled. Behind the counter stood a middle-aged shopkeeper who looked up with a friendly smile. "Good morning," the man said. "Morning," James replied. The shop wasn't large, but rows of shoes lined the walls neatly. There were sandals, boots, running shoes, and simple everyday footwear. James suddenly felt a little unsure of himself. He had never really bought shoes for someone else before, especially not for someone like Tu Diep. The shopkeeper walked over. "Looking for something specific?" he asked. James hesitated for a moment before answering. "Yeah, I need a pair of walking shoes." "For you?" James shook his head. "For someone else?" The shopkeeper nodded knowingly. "A gift?" James gave a small smile. "Something like that." The man gestured toward a row of sturdy shoes. "These are good for walking," he explained. "Strong soles, comfortable." James picked up a pair and examined them. Too bulky. He put them back. Then he picked up another pair. Too heavy. He tried another. Too stiff. The shopkeeper watched patiently. "Does she walk a lot?" the man asked. James nodded. "Every day." "Dirt roads?" "Mostly." The shopkeeper rubbed his chin thoughtfully before walking to another shelf. "What about these?" He handed James a simple pair of shoes. They were light, flexible, and had a thick, durable sole. James turned them over in his hands. They looked right. "Do they last long?" he asked. "Very," the shopkeeper replied. "Good grip, too." James thought about the uneven dirt paths around the bamboo forest. "Do you have this in a smaller size?" he asked. The shopkeeper raised an eyebrow. "You know her size?" James nodded slowly. "About this big," he said, gesturing with his hands. The shopkeeper chuckled. "Good enough." After a moment of searching, the man returned with the correct size. James held the shoes again. For some reason, he imagined Tu Diep wearing them while walking down the same path through the bamboo forest. He imagined her stepping confidently over rocks and dirt without slowing down, without that slight tilt in her step, without worn soles. James nodded. "I'll take them." The shopkeeper placed the shoes into a neat box. "Someone's going to be very happy," he said with a smile. James hoped he was right. When James returned to the bamboo forest later that afternoon, Tu Diep was still outside. She had just finished washing some vegetables and was placing them in a basket when she noticed him approaching. "You're back," she said. James lifted the small box slightly. "Yeah." Tu Diep tilted her head. "What's that?" James walked onto the porch and set the box gently on the wooden table. "It's something I got in town." "For who?" she asked. James looked at her. "For you." Tu Diep blinked. "For me?" "Open it." She stepped closer, clearly confused but curious. Slowly, she lifted the lid. The moment she saw the shoes inside, her eyes widened. "You bought shoes?" she asked in surprise. James nodded. They looked comfortable. Tu Diep carefully lifted one shoe from the box. Her fingers traced the fabric and the sturdy sole. "You didn't have to do this," she said quietly. James leaned casually against the table. "I know." She looked up at him. "My old ones still work." "I know that too." Tu Diep studied his face. "Then why?" James shrugged lightly. "Because I saw you walking yesterday." She looked down at the shoes again. "And?" "You slowed down when the road got rough," James said. Tu Diep didn't answer. James continued gently. "I just thought, maybe you deserve something better to walk in." For a moment, Tu Diep said nothing. Then a soft smile slowly appeared on her face. "You notice a lot of small things," she said. "Only the important ones." She laughed quietly. Then she sat down on the edge of the porch and slipped off her old shoes. The worn pair sat beside her on the wooden floor. Tu Diep placed one of the new shoes onto her foot. It fit perfectly. She stood up and took a few careful steps across the porch. Then she walked down onto the dirt path. James watched closely. "Well?" he asked. Tu Diep walked a few more steps, then turned around. "They're really comfortable," she admitted. A warm smile spread across her face. "See?" James said. She walked back toward him. "Thank you," she said sincerely. They both sat down on the wooden porch, looking out at the quiet bamboo forest. Tu Diep gently placed her old shoes beside the wall. Then she looked down at the new ones on her feet. "You know," she said softly, "the shoes aren't the most important thing." James glanced at her. "No," she shook her head. "What matters is that you noticed." James smiled. Sometimes the smallest gifts carried the biggest meaning. And in that quiet bamboo forest, a simple pair of shoes had just become something much more than that. While walking home through the bamboo forest after a long day in the garden, James notices something he had somehow overlooked for months. Tu Diep is still wearing the same old pair of worn shoes. The soles are thin, the stitching is loose, and she even slows down on rough ground, yet she simply smiles and says the shoes are still good enough. Her simple answer stays in James's mind that night. Quietly, without telling her, he goes into town the next morning and carefully searches for a comfortable pair that would suit her simple lifestyle. When Tu Diep opens the small box later, she is surprised and deeply touched. As she tries the new shoes on the dirt path outside their wooden house, she realizes the real gift is not the shoes themselves, but the fact that James noticed.